Hey, everybody. Welcome to Democracy, Refugees, and Asylum. My name is Elizabeth Nearing, and I'm the curator of Ideas Programming. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, in the land we call home, Connecticut. We hope that from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you are on and the history of the place you are in. We'll pop a link in the comments so that you can check out where you are and learn more about Native land. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas stands with Black Lives Matter and with the countless citizens in our own city and across the country who are exercising their right to protest the systemic racism at the root of police violence. The festival stands in solidarity with Black and Brown communities who are targeted and abused by unjust systems of oppression. And let me tell you personally that you'll notice my hair is wet. I was just outside being rained on with thousands and thousands of New Haveners on the New Haven Green marching in the streets, singing, playing music, and fighting for justice. And so I know that we're doing this program as people are practicing democracy in action. The theme of this year's festival is Democracy, We the People, and we're focusing on people power, which shows up in so many ways and is showing up in streets right in the city I live in right now. And we didn't come up with this program alone. We came up with all of this in partnership with organizations, people around us who have helped us learn what you want to talk about when we talk about democracy. And today I'm really excited that we're working with our partners at IRIS to talk about refugees and asylum and what that looks like in our democracy. So thank you to everybody who's come along with us on this journey. By all means, write your questions in the comments if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook. We'll incorporate them as we go through. And I do want to also make a special thank you to our sponsors. We're working in partnership with Connecticut Humanities and with additional major support from the Whitney Center and media support from Connecticut Public. And without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Zini Malik, who is going to tell us a little bit more about our program from IRIS. Zini.
Hey, thank you, Elizabeth. We're really happy to partner with you and the Festival of Arts and Ideas on this event. So hi, my name is Zini. I'm the Community Engagement and Events Specialist at IRIS. For those who don't know, we are a nonprofit that help refugees and immigrants from all over the world. We welcome and empower our clients by finding them housing, through job placement, enrolling kids in school, providing health and legal services, and lots of other services. If you want to learn more about what we do, please check out our website, irisct.org. So I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists in order of appearance. First up, we have Jasmina Besirevic-Regan. She is the Dean of Trumbull College and a faculty member in the departments of Sociology, Global Affairs, and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale University. She's also on the board of directors at IRIS. Second up, we have Quan Tran. She's the lecturer in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration and American Studies. She has her PhD in American Studies from Yale University. And then last but not least, we have Nour El-Zouabi. She's a rising sophomore at UConn, majoring in physiology and neurobiology, and minoring in chemistry, molecular and cell biology, and Arabic and Islamic civilizations. She's originally from Syria, and she moved to the US with her family in 2016 and was welcomed by IRIS. So we've got a pretty impressive panel here. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Jasmina.
Great. Thank you, Zini. And I want to also thank IRIS and the festival for inviting me for this wonderful occasion. And really, I'm honored to share some of my personal experiences and background. So I fled to the United States in August of 1992 as a 17-year-old high school student who left behind her family. I was actually lucky enough to have secured high school or student exchange visa prior to the beginning of the war, because the war started in March. And as you know, the application process usually starts much earlier. So this enabled me actually to have already visa for the US and leave after 4 months being locked locked in Bosnia. Meanwhile, I was hosted by a family in Minnesota, where I lived for a year. I didn't have any time entering the US at this time, as I mentioned, because I had student visa, but some of the issues that I had to deal later had to do with my non-documented status. As soon as the year was over, I didn't have any other options. Once you enter the US, even though I was from Bosnia, I could not have applied for refugee status because I was already in the country. So I was at that time given a temporary protected status during the Clinton administration. That was a status that enabled me to stay in the US until the war is over. The issue with that was if the war was over within a certain period of time, I could have been deported back immediately. So this really left me with a very difficult decision as an 18-year-old in order to figure out what to do next. I knew that my only real option was really political asylum. And that's, as I know, it's one of the hardest things to prove, this fear of persecution based on your nationality or religion and so on. As a Bosnian Muslim from Banja Luka, I knew that I had a strong case, but it was really hard for me to prove that. So I worked really hard with a human rights clinic at the University of Minnesota, who helped me prepare my case. And the difficulty that I had was really trying to find evidence what was happening in my hometown. Banja Luka is currently and was always the headquarters of the Bosnian Serb army at that time, that really controlled the information that was going into and outside the city. So at that time, there were not many news articles about what was happening. Unfortunately for the Bosnian Muslim community, in May of 1993, several Banja Luka mosques were completely destroyed by the Serbs. And a small article appeared in New York Times, really, that gave me hope, that described kind of the ethnic cleansing and genocide that was happening in the city. And soon after, around that time, more articles began to appear about death and rape camps in the northwestern region of Bosnia, where Banja Luka was situated. And my team that I work with and I felt that was probably enough to prove that as a Bosnian Muslim and as a Muslim woman, there was a real fear of going back home. Fortunately, I was granted political asylum, as I mentioned, with the help of the Human Rights Clinic, and I eventually got a green card and American citizenship later on. In the meantime, I was alone in the United States, and I knew always that education was my ticket to freedom and to kind of independence. So as soon as I finished high school, I have decided to apply for college, and thanks to the huge support from Minnesota community, particularly Augsburg College in Minneapolis, I was able to continue my education without taking any time off. I'm forever grateful for their support, especially my advisor, Diane Pike, who really took me under the wing at this time. We didn't have that many refugees. I didn't speak my language for probably a couple of years, but I did feel at home in Minneapolis. It was a diverse city. Augsburg was a diverse community where I found people who were like me, who went through similar experiences as I did during the 90s crisis. Thanks to my advisor, as I mentioned, throughout my college, I decided to continue my education because I didn't know what else to do, and actually decided to pursue study of genocide and ethnic conflict, which was followed then by my getting a doctorate in sociology from Yale. One thing that I think helped me through my kind of experience is that time when I first came to the United States, my English was very limited. I remember I was in high school as a senior and I was taking 10th grade English classes in order to kind of catch up and learn and be able to converse with others. And obviously over the time, my language skills got better. But also having time to kind of understand and learn what had happened in my country and why enabled me to kind of process what was happening, why things were happening, and finally to start speaking about it and being more open about it. And that's where I got the idea actually for my dissertation research, to go back to my hometown, to go back to Bosnia and do ethnographic work on Bosnian Muslims from Banja Luka. And that experience for me was particularly healing because I was able to learn from others who stayed there during the war in terms of what they've been through, how they survived, and what their hopes and goals for the future were. So that, as hard as that experience was, I think enabled me to come out stronger, to be more confident, and to really give voice to this sometimes silent community. Another defining experience was that when I was at Yale as a student, I worked with a human rights clinic at the Yale Law School, where I worked as a translator or interpreter. And I also worked at IRIS as an English teacher. And at this time, obviously in the 90s, there were lots of refugees, particularly from Bosnia. And I was able to give back that little part where I could teach mostly elderly Bosnians or people from other parts of former Yugoslavia, give them a few English lessons. So for me, it was really a full circle when I was invited and obviously accepted to serve on the IRIS executive board that is composed obviously of different individuals, some of them former refugees and others very professional and successful members. One other thing that I just wanted to personally to mention, that this time allowed me to kind of develop as a daughter, as a wife, as a mother, as a colleague, as a scholar, and kind of take the information in and see how I can help others. And I think I'm finally at the point where I can do presentations like this. I can reach others, because I feel once you're a refugee, you're always a refugee. Even though we all come from different parts of the world, from different kinds of experiences, we also have one experience in common, and that was feeling of fear, desperation, feeling of lack of belonging and identity, and kind of anxiety about future. And it is my hope that through my experience, I can give hope to other refugees that things will get better, that we understand each other regardless to where you come from. We can succeed, and we are resilient. We are generous, we are strong. So one of the things that I learned is that even when my own children complain about some of the petty issues, I can look back and say, I'm so glad this is the problem for you, but these are first world problems, and kind of look back and learn from my experiences. So lots of lessons learned through my life, and I'm still learning and still applying how I can be a better in promoting refugee rights and asylee rights. So I would like now to introduce my friend Quan, who will give her presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Just trying to share my screen because I do have some visual for my part. So just give me 1 second, please. Tiffany, could you see my screen up? Okay, sorry, I can't see the screen. So I'm assuming that you can see my screen, the sharing. Thank you, Zini, for your introduction. And first, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible pain and anger that our nation, and especially our underserved and underrepresented communities, are experiencing at this moment due to the pandemic, the deep-seated structural racism, and the job losses, and all of their compounded effects. And I just wanted to express my deepest sympathies to the families of George Floyd, Deshaun Reed, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, who would have turned 27 today, and the families of so many Black and brown bodies who died in the hands of the police over the years. And secondly, I'd like to thank the International Arts and Festival of Arts and Ideas, as well as IRIS, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thought with you and my co-panelists, and I'm thankful to be in your company as we navigate this very challenging moment in the history of our nation together. So I was born and raised in Vietnam, and I came to this country the summer I turned 13. My family arrived in Southern California as political refugees in 1993. And this month actually marks our 27th year in the US. We had to leave Vietnam because my father had served in the South Vietnamese Air Force during the Vietnam War and was imprisoned in communist re-education camps after the war ended. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with that history, the Vietnam War was both a Cold War proxy and a civil war that was fought in what is now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the war ended in spring 1975 with a communist victory won by North Vietnam, which was backed by the Soviet Union and the Republic of China. And the defeated sides were the South Vietnamese, which were backed by the US. And so the post-war years saw a massive influx of refugees out of Vietnam, but also out of Laos and Cambodia. But for now, I'll just focus on the Vietnamese context, which occurred in three main waves. The first were those who were South Vietnamese who left the days before and during the time that Saigon fell. So you may be familiar with these images of Vietnamese being evacuated from the rooftop of the US Embassy in Saigon in 1975. And then the second wave consisted of those who left the country between 1970, the tail end of the summer of 75 through 1992, and they were known more popularly as boat people because they had escaped Vietnam on ill-equipped vessels crossing the South China Sea, seeking temporary asylums in other Southeast Asian countries nearby, and waiting for permanent resettlement opportunities in the United States as well as in other Western countries. And then the third wave were those who left Vietnam in what was known as the Humanitarian Operation Program, which was under what was also known as the Orderly Departure Program, which was an international attempt to hone in the kind of clandestine escape that was really dangerous, and to allow people with the kind of right reasons to leave Vietnam in a more orderly way. And so my family left in this particular wave. And in particular, my family entered the US under the program for former re-education camp detainees. And as you can see here, that particular wave of people left, by airplane. And then this is actually a picture of my family the summer that we arrived in the US. That was actually on my birthday. And so as a newly arrived refugee, a teenager in the US, I had a lot of questions, right? Questions about why my family had to leave our homeland, questions about the US society, which was completely foreign to me, and questions about where we fit in and not fit in, right? So I think all of these curiosities really pushed me to follow an educational trajectory that eventually led me to pursue a PhD in American Studies and trying to understand the history of this particular migration and my place in it, but also to understand, right, what refuginess means, and especially the stories of those who've been displaced and how they manage to deal with their historical circumstances. And that led me to my work. My PhD work was focused on the boat people exodus and the memories of that mass migration, and ways in which the refugees who've been dispersed around the world are memorializing that particular migration through memorials that they've built in countries where they've resettled, the different trips that people made to the former asylum camps, the kind of music and cultural productions or artwork that emerge from this particular refugee experience. And for me, I'm really interested in how these kinds of cultural productions and memory work enable those who've been dispersed to form a sense of community, to reconcile with the histories, right, both of their countries of origin, but also the countries of where they've landed. And how they form communities that are interlinked with each other across the vast global diaspora. So this leads me to also a desire to understand refugees as a configuration that is right beyond just the legal definition that is determined by the United Nations, but to also see refugeness as a kind of evolving identity, right? An identity that sees both a kind of a reconciliation with loss, but also the opportunity to actually create something new out of the the experiences of the displacements. So with that, I'll end my quick introduction. So I'd like to pass it on to Nour.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nour. Thank you so much, Quan, for blessing me, and thank you for International Festival Art and Ideas and Iris for having me today to speak to all of you about my own experience. As Zaini said, I am from Syria and was resettled in the US by the help from Iris in 2016. It's my journey as a refugee started in December 22nd, 2012, the day my parents, sister, and brothers, and four brothers, and I were registered as a refugees. The bomb attack from the previous day had finally pushed us to leave. On that day, it was scary to wait in the line at the border to leave my own home. But there was no more options because safety was our #1 priority. Moving from Syria to Jordan, where my name became a refugee instead of Nour. Everything went very hard until 2014 when my dad received a call about leaving to the United States, and our application took about 2 years until we finally came to the US in 2016. As many other refugees around the world, it seems so hard to leave our home country and start looking for a home that is just safe for everybody to stay, along with about 16,000 Syrian refugees who had been resettled in the US. I came to New Haven, where I start to feel that I have home now and start to feel safe. I started high school directly and repeated 1 year. However, thankfully, I graduated last year, but honored with distinction. Being a long journey as a refugee, it seems so hard to start again, but thanks to everybody who was there along with us along the way to help, especially Iris, who are not helping only me, but others, thousands of refugees from many other countries around the world to really start our new life here by providing all the basic rights to start, or all the basic needs to really start a new life. That being said, I'm a rising sophomore now at the University of Connecticut, majoring in physiology and neurobiology, and hoping to become a doctor one day to be able to really give back to my community, not only the refugees community, but people in my new home and my new community, and also giving back to places where there are no doctors and there are a lack of everything, basic life needs to live in any places that has war or any other problems. As being said, yeah, this is about me. Thank you so much again for having me. And now we will take some questions.
Thank you so much, Nour, Quan, Jasmina, for sharing that. And it's so great to have such diversity on this panel. Quan, a question for you from Rich Stein. What are the approximate sizes of the population that left in each of the 3 waves? Oh, Quan, you're actually muted.
Could never.
Happens to us.
Thanks for your question, Rick. The first wave that left Vietnam in 75 comprised of about 130,000 people. Now, within even that wave, there were about half of them were airlifted, and then the other half actually left Vietnam vis-a-vis military Navy ships. And they, ended up in Guam and then later dispersed in 4 different military camps on stateside. The second wave had about 800,000 people who left by smaller boats. So you can see in the earlier picture. And then the orderly departure program wave had about 600,000 people.
Great. And we've actually had some questions submitted even before we started. So one of those questions, and Jasmina, this might be directed towards you, but open to anyone who'd like to answer it. There are so many challenges to a refugee successfully seeking asylum through our legal system. And it seems like it has gotten worse in the last few years. What are the most successful strategies, and what do you see happening in the next few years, especially considering the upcoming election?
Thank you, Zini. I think the person who asked the question is right. I think things went from good to worse in the U.S. I think it's really hard to be a refugee in the States, especially to seek political asylum. I think our best bet is really a change of presidency and change of the leadership, because in this kind of current political situation, there's not a lot of support and help. We know that through the IRIS's work and organizations such as IRIS, who help and support refugees on many different levels, but also other immigrants, political asylee, and other people who are already incorporated in the society. I think the best support systems are to get engaged, to reach out to organizations such as IRIS and other kind of human rights clinics that offer different kind of support for people who have a background in legal system, for people who have academic backgrounds who can help refugees or immigrants who are seeking political asylum or refugee status in the States. But I feel we are in this together. This country is composed of refugees. We need to help each other any way we can. I would not be here today without the help, really, and the support of the students from the law school who helped put together this case, because as an 18-year-old, I didn't have a clue what I was collecting and what I was going through. So I think together we can do this if we provide services, if we get involved, if we whether it's donation, whether it's teaching English level classes, whether it's providing expertise advice, we can change this. And we really, bottom line is the change of leadership this year.
Yeah. Absolutely. We have another question that's sort of tied to that as well. How can communities be helpful to encourage our Congress and leaders to reopen the refugee resettlement program as soon as possible?
Can I take on that question? I'll just share my screen really quick, because I do have some visual that can be helpful.
Yeah. It's a tough question that I'm sure we're all kind of grappling with, especially at IRIS.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm looking at the slides. I won't go full screen because I can't see the comments. But if you look at this screen, right, this is the refugee admissions and resettlement ceilings for the fiscal year since 1980 through 2020. So this year marks the 40th anniversary of the Refugee Act of 1980s. And you can see that was probably one of the most quote unquote generous moment in the history of U.S. resettlement, refugee resettlement. And it kind of dips and then rose over the years. And if we go all the way now to 2020, it's almost at the bottom, right? And this is a trend that happens both in the kind of current political climate, but also internationally, right? As various countries are really shrinking sort of their willingness to resettle refugees. And then if we look at this slide, and we're looking at refugee populations around the world that is completely exploded in the last few decades, right? Instead of going down, that number continues to rise. And if we're looking at the 18,000 cap that the U.S. is resettling refugees in this fiscal year, that is minute. It's not even a feather, right? In the context of these figures that we're looking at now. In terms of the international numbers. So currently we have 70, this is information coming out of the UNHCR, 70 million people who are displaced worldwide. Among them, 41 million are internally displaced, and 25.9, right, almost 26 million people are considered refugees under the convention definition, and then 3.5 million asylum seekers. And all of these numbers are continuing to rise, right? So one way in thinking about how do we pressure our elected officials to keep the pulse on these numbers, but also to remind our obligation, right? Because the United States is signatory to the UN Convention on the Status of Refugee in the protocol. So that is actually not just, the U.S. should not be a kind of the generosity is at its own will, but actually is an obligation, is an international obligation to think about refugees and their resettlements. At the same time, we also have to think about refugees as the U.S., right, as both a country that produces refugees, via wars that take place outside of the U.S., right, but at the helm of U.S. foreign policy, and also the country that receive refugees, right? So those kinds of public conversations should emphasize those points, because if we just kind of leave it to the kind of more humanitarian, yes, in some years we have a more liberal policy than other years, it becomes it becomes more difficult to make the argument, the actual argument that says we are responsible for these numbers as well.
If I may add, I think it's also important to educate ourselves. We live in a current political climate that we can see that some aspects of democracy are disappearing. We obviously all don't look the same. We don't talk the same. We come from different backgrounds. But I think exposure and education are the key components here in terms of learning about others, getting away from stereotypes, getting away from dehumanization, and identifying and separating different kind of communities would definitely help. And obviously writing and calling our officers, senators, representatives, and so on, and putting pressure on them to do something, because refugees are at the heart of this country. I think this is, all of us make our lives better. Refugees are resilient, resourceful, hardworking individuals who contribute to American society like any other individuals. And I think sometimes there are stereotyped at certain groups, and people are discouraged from getting to know them or learning more about them. I mean, we obviously live in a liberal bubble here in New Haven, but I think we need to reach out to the rest of the communities and speak out.
Jasmina, you actually said something earlier that kind of stuck with me. You said once a refugee, always a refugee. And I was really intrigued by that. And maybe I can start with you, Nour, on this question. Is wondering what that term, what that word refugee kind of means to you, whether it's like the technical aspect, the social aspect. And, since Nour, you've just arrived here just only 4 years ago, thought I could start with you on that question.
Yeah, sure. So being a refugee, I will not go with the technical definition, even it's right. Being someone who's looking for a home, do it to any reason that makes their life in danger. And push them to really leave their houses and their homes on the countries that they have been in for so long since they came to the world. So I will define refugees as someone who's looking for a home more than just looking for anything else, looking for an opportunity to be part of a community and to really feel safe. Also, having others to really help, not only, so I will go not looking for, I don't mean home by having an actual house that you live in. Having being in a home is being in a community where you are being loved and welcomed by everybody, regardless of your religion, color, or any other difference that make you special.
I think for me, the refugee identity kind of evolved over time. I remember coming to this country, as I mentioned, I came by myself at that time, not as many refugees in 92 in Minnesota. I felt different from others. I didn't speak the language well. I didn't have lots of means, but I did have support from people around me, and obviously from my family that was back in Bosnia. I think I went from the process of being almost embarrassed because I was that kid in the school who couldn't afford to have a senior year picture. But I think over time I got to be proud. I learned that I can contribute as much as everyone else, that I can learn the language, that I can be better at something than somebody else. I learned kind of to embrace it, what I am and what I have to contribute to the society. And now I feel it empowered. I feel I am who I am because of that experience. And as bad as it was, I feel I would not change it for anything. I feel the experience have grounded me, have put me in the place where I can step back and say, okay, you're complaining now about stupid stuff that doesn't matter. Look at your neighbor or other people who are struggling, crossing the border, who don't have a roof under their head or enough food. So I kind of turn it around in my own mind, and I'm kind of proud of it. I still joke with my friends sometimes. I would come and say, oh, when I was a refugee, and they just laugh. But it is part of who I am, and I think it has changed as a scholar. I feel like I can give voice to this community that is struggling. As a mother, I can provide experiences for my kids of people who are, experiences that hopefully they will never go through. And as a person, just kind of fight for the basic human rights in this country. So my whole kind of identity in terms of being a refugee evolved. But again, I'm proud to be a refugee.
Yeah, I share the same sentiment. I think for me, being a refugee also means to have to reconcile with a lot of histories, right? Both the history of the country from where you are forced out, but also the country in which you enter, right? And as a person who have to kind of straddles all of these histories and politics, at the same time, I've always, think of refugees as a set of people who have kind of been yanked, right? The carpet pulled out of their feet, and people who had to reconstitute themselves and remake their lives in however ways that they're able to. And I find a lot of inspirations in that. I've seen my parents going, through the process of rebuilding their lives, and because of that, I think it drives home more the need to appreciate, right, or the feeling of appreciation for what one has. But at the same time, to be attentive to the suffering of other people as well. And that making it to a country of resettlement doesn't really mean the end of your journey is there, right? It actually means that it is a kind of a second opportunity of really reinventing yourselves and taking with you all of that histories. And so, yeah, I totally agree with Jasmina's statement that like once you're a refugee for life, right? And it's not just like for your life, but it's also like the lives of those who've come, who come after you, right?
Yeah.
And also the lives of those who come before you, because I don't think my family would have been resettled in the U.S. had it not been for the kind of advocacy work that other communities have done on behalf of our people, right? And advocating for us to come into this country. So a very recent example with Black Lives Matter, there's been some acknowledgement, right, of the intersections of Southeast Asian refugees and the Black communities in this country. And one of the things I've seen kind of floating around social media is, and I can share this image really quickly. Oh, you can just see my own. Can you see the screen?
Not yet. Maybe it'll come up in a minute. Okay, there we go.
I'll full screen this right now. So what you're looking here is an image that was found by Sukhantari Svay, who found this in the foreign desk records of the New York Times at the New York Public Library. And this is an article or a page, an ad that was taken out by African-American civil rights leaders, right, who are urging for the admissions of Indo-Chinese refugees in 1978. And if you want to read more about it, Trin Trung, who is a Yale alumna, has recently written a very interesting article that's called What Southeast Asian Refugees Owe to Black Lives. But basically, I wanted to share this because I wanted for us to think about the kinds of connections that refugees communities, as they enter this country, it's not like they're entering it in a vacuum, right? But they're part and parcel to a much longer history of this country as well. So my sense is, being a refugee also means to take on the kind of story that, like I mentioned before, the stories that laid the path for you to come here, but also the stories that you yourself are making as you move forward in the future.
Thank you all for sharing that. We also have another question that just came in from Marwan. And what are the challenges that refugee youths face in the US currently? So Nour, if you want to take that one.
Oh, absolutely. I think the first thing that we have mentioned before is the language. I, as myself, someone who came from Jordan with zero English except yes and no. It's the only two words that I know. And I think other than language, being able to really make yourself feel accepted in the community, or especially in the school, as we know, many kids are still not educated enough about refugees and resettlement, or like immigration in general, where students will really face a hard time trying to connect with everybody and trying to have the sense of belonging to this place. I think other than that, also being able to kind of really learn, then other than language, being able to accept it to the community, also being part of the community, and instead of just receiving help, finding way ourselves to kind of really give back to our community and help others who are really in need, and other refugees who came to the country also without a language. I think many of us become translator for either our parents, our siblings, or like anybody else who just need our help, and become advocate for other refugees and immigrants coming out of the country, and asking our government to really bring more people who need a safe place.
I think also, if I may add, one thing that is different that I just noticed in terms of age, when I was a refugee, I think the internet just started. So it was the first time that CNN effect happened, that you could actually watch conflict as it was going on through CNN. And that was something amazing. And I feel youth, or the kids these days, are maybe in a more difficult position because of the social media and internet and everything, because others can create their own opinions of what refugees are and what they mean without giving a refugee an opportunity to kind of express themselves or to educate others. Sometimes if you could pass as non-refugee, you were able to pass because no one knew who you were. I mean, obviously it depends on your physical characteristics, but in general, if you didn't speak, you could go to the store, purchase whatever you needed to, and no one knew that you were refugees. Nowadays, with social media and taking pictures and posting things online, I think refugees are a lot more visible for good and for bad. I mean, I think it can be used for positive results, but also it can have a negative consequences too.
Yeah, another element that I think could, be added is also the kind of internal negotiations that young refugees have to navigate with their own families, right? Coming from different kind of cultural expectations, and also trying both to deal with, like, say, the American society from the external, but also perhaps some of the more traditional family values or whatnot at home, that can create a lot of angst and conflict, right? As young people are trying to find a sense of belonging in these new communities. So I know that, for example, the Vietnamese American community, for example, there were a lot of young Vietnamese who were just having a very tough time trying to figure out where their place is in this country, even their own place in their family. So those are some of the things I think compound together that makes some of the challenges for young refugees very unique.
Also adding to what Jasmina said about media, social media and media in general, that people who don't know about refugees start to make their own statement about who they are without really getting to know them, and start to belong them to different groups that they are not just part of, or they don't count as of them, the way to everybody here from social media that may be fake and not who they are. I think this is the most important one, is that people still don't know who you are, and even come to the point where they will refuse to to get to know you the way to everything they hear from media in general.
Yeah, I think that brings up questions on identity, which is like a whole other topic, which maybe one day we can dive into. But I have another question here from Henry. So I think this is actually a pretty common question, and people are wondering. Nour, it's directed to you, but we can, have the other, Quan and Jasmina also add to it. Do you know if your family had a choice in coming to the U.S. and then New Haven? What is the process for placement?
So actually, that's a very important question. Thank you for asking, Henry. For the process, so it took us about 2 years. However, we were one of the families that have the choice to go to either Canada or coming to the US. So after many searches and going online, for my parents, other than safety, education was #1 priority. And coming to the US, especially to Connecticut, all other places are full of very good institutions and good universities and colleges, also schools for education. However, after they search a lot, they ended up being able to choose to go to Connecticut. After looking to many places, first we came to New Haven, and other than education, also being in a community was something hard. We did not know a lot of people. We have 0-member family here in the US in general and in New Haven, but deciding to stay in New Haven and Connecticut, I think, was also a choice that not only us have to make, but also many people are making. And for us, having a family is also made a difference when we came here. However, before coming to the US, for some countries, resettlement programs are very limited, and some families don't really have the choice to choose where they are going to be resettled. So the program is kind of, as we said, it's really depend on the family and what are their priority. So that's how we decided to come to the US and not going to Canada.
I think in general, I think you can decide a country, right? Whether it's US or Canada, but it would depend on the resettlement agencies and where they have spots, right? And this is part of what IRIS does, actually looking for co-sponsorship and different kind of support systems for refugees or immigrants to find a place for them. I remember, again, you know, I came under different circumstances, but when I came to Minnesota at that time, I came in a small town where they're all white people. There were not that many minorities, and I was the only refugees. I even remember that the family that took me in didn't even know there was a war in Bosnia. I mean, they were completely clueless at the time. But I know that lots of families, once one family comes, then these communities try to come together and sponsor each other. So in terms of, I know Bosnian community, obviously there's New York, Chicago, St. Louis is also a big community. So they try to follow each other, but I don't think there's a choice in terms of, I'm going to go to California over Indiana. I mean, it's all dependent on where are the people who want to accept these refugees and support them.
Yeah, so it's historically the policy is to disperse refugees in many different pockets of the country as possible, because the logic is that not to overburden any particular single municipality. But as Jasmina mentioned, right, people also, once they initially get resettled, they also move through what's called secondary migration to places where, their compatriots might have found a better life. So by the time that, for example, my family came to the US in 1993, we immediately resettled in Southern California because the Vietnamese American community has already been quite established at the time. And so literally, when I entered Southern California, I could actually get by without speaking any English because of how established the community was, right? But there are cases of people who've been resettled in sort of the middle of nowhere. And for those, individuals and families, those are the most difficult situations in just trying to find a sense of belonging and establishing themselves.
Great. And just before we wrap up, we have just two last questions. One is from Kelsey. How do we engage in political activism for refugees? Should pressure for a legislation reform be focused on a particular level, such as local versus state versus federal? And then we have one last question from John, which is, what brings joy to each of the panelists while struggling with life here in the US? So you can go ahead and pick which one you'd like to answer.
Okay, Kelsey's question, I mean, it has to probably be all three, right? Because sort of the way in which the refugee system in the US works. And I think that and we've seen that historically in how people have taken up actions, both locally at the state level and federally. And so I think we need to remember those kind of lessons, right? And we need to not let that go, especially in the moment of such difficult political climate that continue to push, right? And I think, the dip that we see that's all the way towards zero at this point, we have to see that as a temporary dip, right? And to pick it up through the actions, the advocacy that we do, and to remind ourselves, right? Hardly are the stories of refugees are being mentioned now, right? If you compare that to, say, 2016, 2017. And I think we have to not let the kind of news cycle dictate how we respond to refugee conditions, right? Because even though things are not mentioned in newspaper, refugees are still experiencing refuginess across the world, right? And to kind of keep that pressure is really important.
Oh, also adding to what Quan said is, really, it didn't, when trying to differentiate between the level where we have to start advocating for refugees, it all starts by educating yourself about refugees and deciding that you will start to advocate for them. Then it will start with your community, with your own community, going back from local up into the state and finally to the federal level, where people from all the country, all the nation, as many of us said, unity is power. If not everybody came together, we don't really get to achieve the federal level if we did not start with the local level. I think one of the things that everybody can do is, other than advocating themselves, is to come along with their community and organization like IRIS or any other organization that is really there to support refugees and immigrants and asylum seekers from all around the world.
In terms of joy while struggling with life in the US, I think all of us probably feel joy when we hear of success stories. Marwan was the one who asked the question, and he's our success story. What a guy. I think I love seeing refugees succeed, whether it's on career level, education level, just being productive, resilient citizens. I also love when I teach Yale summer session with another professor. We bring students to Croatia and Bosnia over the summer, and I love to share part of my culture. As bad as some things happen there, I love to share the food, the culture, the habits, the lifestyle, so that these youngsters can see that in all of these bad things that happen, there is some joy, there is something good that comes out of it, that we are all the same. We have similar struggles, but we also know how to enjoy life. And for me, seeing that when the brain starts working, that we go through similar instances, and just because you see worn-torn pictures of certain places in the world, it doesn't mean that they are not also happy places in some sense. And you know, most of all, I miss the food. I love going to Bosnian families and and getting some good Bosnian meals, as well as some other culturally appropriate meals. So.
Thank you. I think John's question is a perfect way to wrap this up. I personally get so much joy with meeting refugees and immigrants because they are so warm, and just the way they enrich our community. It's been such a great experience being at IRIS. And thank you so much, Quan, Nour, Jasmina, for your really thoughtful and eloquent insights on this topic. And again, Elizabeth, I know you're around somewhere. Thank you so much for letting IRIS partner with you on this event. And this is such an important conversation that I hope we can keep the conversation going even, you know, after this is all over. So thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for listening and watching. And yeah, we hope to keep this going. Hey, Elizabeth.
Hey, thank you all so much. That was beautiful. I realized my little speaker was just up.
We heard a little bit.
It's always a delight to share space with you all and work with you. I do want to say another partner of Iris's, Sanctuary Kitchen, works with refugee chefs, and they're doing a dinner event with Arts and Ideas tomorrow night. We're really excited to eat some delicious food. And I also want to say we have a survey. If folks could let us know what you think, what you want to hear more about, it's artidea.org/survey. And we have a bunch more programming coming up next week. Keep up. And I want to end with a moment of joy that I had with a friend of mine who I met through IRIS. And his name is Joseph, and he taught me a word. He's from the Congo, and he taught me this word that he called me last week and reminded me of it. And the word is Ikosimba. And what it means is one day everything will be all right. And he called and he said, you know, I think that's something that we need to remember and work through. And so I just leave you all with that word, Ikosimba. And we'll see you all soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.